Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Future of XYZ. With us today is architect and designer Suchi Reddy. Suchi, thanks so much for joining us.
I'm so happy to be here, Lisa. It's always fun to chat with you. So I can't wait to see what we're going to discover about the future today.
I can't either, actually. And this topic is super cool. And as we were talking about, super geeky. You are the founder of a design studio based in New York City called Reddy, which you founded in 2002. You
Yes.
are an architect by training and were recently inducted or elevated, I should say, to the College of Fellows at the AIA, the American Institute of Architects. So congratulations on that.
Thank you so much. It's really such an honor. Only 3% of registered architects actually get to say that. And I'm actually very proud of this. So it's great.
You should be, and as a woman, as a young woman too. So
Not so young, but let's
pretty young for a FAIA. But
yeah.
you teach at Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, and I believe that you have a artist in residence at Colgate University in upstate New York.
Yes, which I just completed, in fact, with that just culminated in an installation that's called Bias and Belonging.
Ooh, very interesting. Well, maybe we'll have a chance to talk about it. You serve on a bunch of different boards, including Madam Architect, and you're based in New York City, as so many of our guests are, but you were raised in India. And I think germane to today's conversation, before we dive into it, is, perhaps one of your most interesting claims to fame, which is, of course, your role in the world as a leading figure in the field of neuroaesthetics. And you've spoken about this at Aspen Ideas and City Lab and various other places. And we're going to talk about the future of neuroaesthetics today. So with no further ado, I always ask the first question based on your expertise. How do we define neuroaesthetics?
Neuroaesthetics is a translational field that involves the work of a whole host of disciplines and academics and practitioners from around the world. That includes neuroscientists, cognitive scientists, psychologists, architects, artists, all coming together to understand the effect of experience and art and design experiences on the brain and the body. In other words, what does your world do to your brain and body? How are you reacting to it?
I mean, pretty much it's everything. It's like, how are we stimulated by the world around us?
Yes. Small goal to study. But, such a timely thing in design, because certainly being at IAT, right? That it's all about innovation and it's all about understanding how we can use the knowledge of our time to really improve our craft and our work. And I would say, the Bauhaus affected design for 100 years because they were looking at the technology of their time. And our technology in our time, neuroscience is one of those fields that's made giant leaps in the last 50 years. So to bring that together with aesthetics, art, architecture, a geek like me could not be happier.
I love it. And that's a super helpful context for the next 20-ish minutes of our conversation. I mean, your work generally is known to push the boundaries of architecture's role, I would say, in shaping what you call a more empathetic, equitable, and enriching built environment. What in practice does this actually look like, and how do neuroaesthetics kind of intersect?
So, that's such an interesting way of phrasing the question. Thank you. I always joke and say we've got everything happening in the office, from a 4-inch round object to a campus plan. And the idea and the principles that are uncovered through the study of neuroaesthetics actually guide the design of all of them. So if I'm looking at, we did a small object for a spirits company that was meant to enhance the experience of having one of those spirits. And I created a beautiful stone dish that looked like the color of the liquid. I created an incense that actually worked with the smell. And so you did both while you drank, and it was to bring to mind this Proustian effect, right? Of jogging memories through scent, through smell, through experience, through taste, to bringing all of the senses together. So that same thread, actually, from that 4-inch thing, we go into residential design, where we're looking at kinds of spaces and experiences within a residence very carefully. And here we get to think about generally one user, one group of users, right? So we know them pretty well. We get to have pretty close conversations as to what makes them feel comfortable, what makes them feel included, what makes them feel creative. And depending on what the person needs, the spaces are both architecturally and from a design perspective modulated based on the ideas of color, proportion, texture, stimulus. Like, how much stimulus do you need in a space? How little? Maybe you need some quiet space that's contrasted by a really small kind of, diorama. If you're a creative person and you're writing and you need to go off into another world, but come back, what are the cues that allow you to do the kinds of things you do? If we're looking at a retail space and we're looking at bringing a brand to life, then it's really looking at what's the ethos of that brand. How are we amplifying that brand? Like when we did Google's first retail store ever in Chelsea, in New York, it was a software giant, had never been physical. So to bring them into the world, but also bring that sense of play and adventure and work with an existing space, dematerialize the screen, make it a space where you exhale, where it's warm, it's not white and shiny, it's not aspirational. It's really a place where you can go to discover. That was important. Finding out that sense of awe, wonder, and discovery that honestly is at the base of technology. It's why we like technology. We discover something. So like to go to that principle and then discover that through design. So that's how we translate it, through a lot of different lenses and a lot of different scales, but all the time bringing the talents of the team together with what the design brief offers.
You've been known in your architectural and design work broadly. As you say, you speak about this object for the beverage company, which I believe I remember being in your studio. I think it's a whiskey brand that we're describing.
Indeed.
Which I remember well. It's so cool. And there's this idea that, form follows feeling.
Yes.
And I think a lot of people would actually think the opposite, that you feel based on the form.
Right.
Can you talk about that interplay a little bit?
That is also such an interesting way to ask that question. So, as an architect, you grow up, right? You're inculcated with this idea that form follows function. And of course, form follows function. Form has to follow function. Otherwise, it doesn't need to exist, right? In a certain way. But ideally. But what I realized about, I would say, a decade or so into my practice, which is now almost coming up on 2.5 decades, was that what I really cared about was designing towards feeling. So I wanted form to follow feeling. Like for instance, we did a collectible furniture line. You might ask, why is an architect doing a furniture line? But that's not so unusual. And this was a collaboration with a centuries-old weaving house in India, and it was about bringing the sari to life on the world stage and really creating the series of forms that are all one form, that are all about wrapping the body. So when you look at it, you feel the kind of fluidity and the softness, right, of how you feel when you're wrapped in a sari. So that's the idea, to really sort of bring these things together always. But for me, on a larger scale, it's also about looking at how we design our world. Because for me, we really design our world outward from the body. Like that's the place where I'm interested, and I really call this like the democratic space of the body, the language that we all understand, regardless of socioeconomic differences or race or caste or whatever. Everything comes back to here. And from here, we build our worlds. So we build our clothing as our first home, our homes, then our cities, then our towns, then it goes that way. And I think the through line has to be, how do we feel in these spaces?
It's interesting because you've done a lot of advocacy work in addition to research, design, and teaching, education, and whatnot, about neuroaesthetics, but generally design, and really this profound impact that design has on human perception, and in your words, well-being.
Yes.
I'm curious how you came to this realization, and if the field of neuroaesthetics is one, really the term, not just the field, because obviously neuroscience and all the rest of it is there, but like, is neuroaesthetics something that you've named, or is this
God,
a
no.
field that like exists more broadly? How did you
No,
come to this?
the term was actually created by Semir Zeki from the University College of London. And you can look that up. It's been around for a long time. The field itself is, I would say, about 25 years old. So a little bit older than my practice. But and yes, now, people say neuro arts and they say neuro architecture. And honestly, I don't know what all of those things mean. I do know that aesthetics in general is something that we can fall under, the specializations and under that I'm not an expert on necessarily. But what I would say is it's really funny. I go back to my childhood and my upbringing so often when these questions come up, because I happen to be lucky enough to grow up in a house in India that was actually designed by an architect and he had a giant Japanese influence to his work. He was the only architect who had bonsai trees in Chennai, and the house had such a profound effect on me as a child. I remember having an epiphany, and I must have been around 10, and I remember like the temperature and where I was standing in the house. And I was like, oh, my house is making me different than my friends because my house is different than my friend's house, and it wasn't sort of better or worse or anything. I just recognized my environment as a protagonist in the
Yes.
person that I was becoming, right? And
Yes.
that actually drove me to become an architect, to really understand the power of space, and you see it all the time. Like we know how to design prisons to make people feel bad. We're not looking at the rest of the world from that lens. We're not looking at how do we make people feel great. We're looking at, okay, how do we build this for, how much square footage can we get and how,
Money, ultimately,
money,
usually.
which we have to look at, no question.
Yeah.
But all of that has to be directed, I think, and underpinned by this idea of how are we using all of those constraints to actually do something that makes people feel better. And that's what I mean by well-being. It's not necessarily so much like, you go into a spa and you can relax like temporarily and then you come out, no, the rest of the world has to be that continuation, that right? That makes you feel like it was designed for you. It was designed for you to do a better thing.
It's really interesting. I want to talk about some of the projects and kind of how you see those get this field evolving, your practice evolving, your clients and users, as you said. Like in a residential, it might be one small group of users, but in public spaces and cultural institutions, all of which you've worked on, it's bigger. But I want to talk about something that I think is really interesting, which was in 2019 in Milan. You worked with Google again, Muto, the furniture brand, and the International Arts and Mind Lab at Johns Hopkins University Brain Science Institute to do this a space for being installation, which you can talk about, but demonstrated how environments elicit measurable physiological responses, not psychological responses. What did you learn from this experience, and how has that perhaps shaped kind of your practice and thinking about neuroaesthetics going forward?
Well, I learned so much from this experience. And I will say that this is how it's actually drawn from the way science is done in a lab, right? Except that in a lab, you have to do something many, many times in order to get a similar result and have controls, which real life doesn't offer you. So you have constantly changing parameters, people coming in affected by whoever they just ran into, and that's affecting their physiology. So, this is the thing, is that we tend to think our physiology is separate from our psychology and our biology, but it isn't. It's all of those things. And those things change all the time, and they change based on the inputs. And space is an input, in my opinion. And that's what I really learned from that. I learned that the ability to also really be able to show people that design was not just a subjective notion. It's not just this makes me feel good. You want to ask the question why.
It's so interesting to me because I'm someone, I really resonate with that idea that like the house you grow up in, it makes you a little different, how you see things, how you experience. And I joke all the time. Like I'm a triple Libra, and one of the, horoscopically, and one of the things about Libras
That
in
explains
general,
a lot.
it does, right? I'm a little afraid of what it explains, but one of the main things about Libras is their attention and appreciation for beauty, and I am hypersensitive to not just beauty, which I think is what you're talking about, like how people expect spaces to be designed, but like if I walk into a space that has like energy that doesn't feel good, that feels stagnant, airflow that feels stagnant, colors that are abrasive, textures, but especially lighting, right? It's so important. And it's interesting because even I, as we came into this conversation, Suchi, was like, let's see where this conversation goes, because that's future of XYZ every episode. But I'm so fascinated because I would never have used that expression neuroaesthetics, but it's exactly that. Yeah. It's the physiological response that I have when in an environment, and I'll call it beauty, but that doesn't resonate, that doesn't put me at ease, that puts me a little bit, and I might be more sensitive than many, but it's exactly that. It actually impedes my ability to relax, to be myself, etc. So you've done a fair amount of research on this across residential and commercial and public installations. Right. Like, what are some of the favorite projects that you've had? And do you feel like you're seeing more interest in kind of designing for this neuroaesthetic response?
I absolutely, see a lot more interest. It's not something that a lot of people come to. First of all, it's a big word. Let's just face it, but what it is your physiological reaction to being in space, So when people say immersive, I don't get it anymore. I'm like, I don't understand. Life is immersive. The world is immersive. I don't
right. Totally.
I don't tell, unless I just have a whole bunch of TV screens and I'm calling that immersive. I don't know. That's my brain. That's not everything, right? So I do feel like the importance of it always resonates with people. When I talk to people about it, they're like, oh yeah, for sure, I get it. And particularly after the pandemic or during the pandemic, people really understood what the value of the space, the quality of the space they were in, what the value of that was to them, right? How did it make them feel? Because you were stuck in it and you were kind of like, what do I do now? How is this making me feel? And people ask the question because also we had so many other things where the feels were really up in the world, right? So you were really tuned in. You weren't thinking about like all the stuff about how to get to work and how to do this. But at its very simplest level, it's what you were saying. It's like removing the friction that keeps you from enjoying a space and being present fully in a space. So, and we do that a lot every day as we go out of our doors, right? We're like, oh, you gotta, be alert. You have to, and you have to do all of those things, and all the systems in your body and your brain are kicking in order to do that. So that is a neuroaesthetic aspect of and let's call it an urban street that exists, right? You go down towards somewhere and you're walking across a blank facade and your cortisol levels rise. And they rise because there's not enough interest in that facade. There's not enough psychological safety that it's showing you. So this is the kind of research that I look at, I draw from, that informs the kinds of things that we do. So in every project, we're looking at that. We're bringing, it might not be everything. Like the most common question I get is like, what's neuroaesthetic about this? I'm like, I don't know, the fact that you're in your body and you're feeling it.
Right.
Or what are the 10 things I can do to make this neuroaesthetic, which is also a difficult question to answer because it's not always the same 10 things.
Right. Because if you ask 10 different people, you're going to get 10 different things.
Exactly. So you really do have to rely on your own skill and intuition and your experience as a designer to be able to synthesize all of this information that's out there, and inform it just like you would if you're, a stockbroker and you're looking at the numbers for the day, or you're looking at data, or you're a geographer and you're understanding some new information that came up on the satellites, right? You look at it to shape your view and you look at it to shape your work. It's the same technique that you have to use. One has to use, I would say.
Yeah, no, it's so interesting. And you talk about bodies of research. I mean, that exist everywhere, but anytime you're hired to do a project is,
Mhm.
whether it be a residence or a commercial interior, whatever it's going to be, you have to take these kind of users into consideration. I'm curious about some of the work you've done in healthcare, because obviously, I think you've done some work, especially for children. And, if we think about the song, like the children are our future and we're a future of XYZ, like, how do you think that designing a healthcare space that, benefits our children when they're in a very vulnerable situation in a medical environment, how do you think that might help them develop into the future?
Well, I mean, there's so many questions within that question. Actually, my very early work, before I even thought about neuroaesthetics, was designing the interiors of a Montessori school and really thinking about, both from the ethos of that kind of teaching of children and their growth, but to see what could actually animate and calm this. And another real factor that has come up is that more and more people identify as neurodiverse, right? So children identify as neurodiverse. There are a lot of, especially with kids now, we're sensitized to kind of see it and understand
Which
it.
is ADHD, autism
Everything.
spectrum, etc.
All of those things. So to understand how design, and particularly from a neuroaesthetic lens, can actually work with all of those things is something I'm terribly interested in and want to carry forward, whether it's in pilot schools or charter schools or, whichever form it comes up with. But the project that you were referring to was it was a design for a prototypical hospital room. And it was for kids who had been suffering from what's called disorders of consciousness. So they could be comas, they could be other neurological disorders, but mostly they're on their back, right? And so one of the features that came up from studying the work around it was really that the stress of the child affects the stress of the caregiver, and likewise, and usually there's nowhere to escape. Like the child might be watching the same cartoon 100 times and it might drive the caregiver crazy. You don't want that to happen because their stress then affects the relationship, of the child to their recovery. So you really want to be able to look at all of this kind of information. I was looking at information about time clocks and body cells. And how do I show the passage of time in the space, even if you didn't have a window? Do you use VR to do that? Do you use audio video to do that? Because then your body tunes in a different way to the passage of time, your cells can reset. So it was very experimental. And this is, honestly, because we're not a giant firm known for healthcare, it's quite a difficult place to implement something, but I've been so lucky to be on the forefront of like being able to think about these things. And so we're constantly working with firms to see how to actually put these into practice. Because the one thing I will say is what we need is more research, and we need more longitudinal data. Like this is young information.
Yeah, no, it's really fascinating, and yes, appreciate like healthcare is a complex and multifaceted area of practice.
Yeah, particularly with liability, it gets very well, most things do these days, but
especially
yes.
in America.
Yeah.
We have global listeners, they might be like, huh, what liability?
What?
What's
Don't you
that?
just try to do the best thing for everyone? Isn't that normal?
Crazy. Before we move into our final question, Suchi, you have done a number of public installations, civic art, cultural spaces, where you use neuroaesthetic principles to evoke connection, wonder, and empowerment. What does the future of this look like, and what role can it play?
I think you'll just see, I think it's evident that there's a hugely increasing role in terms of larger formats of art that people can actually engage with physically. So I've done things like an installation, I should say, at the Smithsonian, where I asked people to give me one word for their future. They speak into my sculpture. I used AI and ML to kind of read the emotion in their voices and reflect that back to them. And I really saw that as they kept repeating words, even though they got these kinds of strident patterns, they got softer and they got more beautiful. This idea that beauty actually affects people. This is like my small ways of doing research, right? Like this is what I see from my work, from doing it. And I can carry that forward and try that in a different iteration and see what happens. And I keep laddering up all of the info that I'm getting from that. So that kind of thing. I also did an installation at the National Building Museum that was meant to
In
attract
DC.
people of all in DC. Yeah. And I don't know if you know the museum, but it's like the
Yeah.
biggest interior space in DC. You feel tiny in it, So the whole idea was to build this kind of circular oval ramp that lifted you up. So you actually felt like the proportions corrected themselves. You felt like you belonged in that.
I
And
read an article about that years ago. When was it? That was a while ago.
that was 3 years ago, I want to say now.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
remember reading an article. I didn't know you did that. Cool.
Yeah, and there were these giant, of course, all my childish things come to play in my work. Where I made these giant kaleidoscopes and these giant kind of fortune teller things. And inside these fortune tellers, I had like visions and images of civil rights marches, the histories of the place. So as you were walking, you could see yourself be reflected in time. So you could also position yourself. And I also really, from that particular instance where I actually thought a lot about neuroaesthetics, I would challenge people to take the same picture twice, and they couldn't because experiencing space is all about where your body is, right? And with these kinds of shiny things that sort of slightly move, people would like, no one won the prize, let's just say that, but they had a lot of fun trying.
Absolutely.
And, creating those kinds of things and now culminating in what I just finished at Colgate, which is called Bias and Belonging, and is still on view until June 2nd. And my first digital textile. So I printed a textile on a digital loom, which I'm super excited about.
Lots of friends are doing this right now. It seems to be like, yeah. I mean, Jamie Derringer, who was the founder of Design Milk, is doing some of this work. And there's a woman from IDEO who was at our trend conference last year. Seems like this is really like, I mean, it's only the smartest of you, I think. And it seems to be largely women, but really fascinating.
I was so excited. And I went into the community and I asked them questions about where they felt bias and where they felt belonging, also because these are always space-based feelings. And often they would be the same place, whether it was church or family or the dinner table or, and we made icons for these and then we projected them on the wall. It was so moving, honestly. People were so moved to see their own work, words and feelings be represented in the work, which is really how I like to make work. So
it sounds that way.
I'm able to use it to talk to people. That's enough.
So final two questions, Suchi, are always the same for every episode of Future of XYZ. For viewers and listeners who want to learn more about neuroaesthetics, is there an iconic reference or an example of design that you would point them to?
Any piece of architecture that moves them is definitely neuroaesthetic. They should just look at it more carefully. For lots of people, that's different. Some people would say the Pantheon. Some people would say the deli on the corner. There's reasons why it works. I would say that. For me, one of the seminal books was actually one written by Richard Neutra, and it's called Survival Through Design. And that he's also aside from being an amazing architect, he's an incredible writer. And it's a really wonderful thing. And then there's another beautiful book I would recommend called Architecture as a Verb that was written by my friend Sarah Robinson. And she brings together ideas of philosophy, art, science, and being into this language. So if anyone's interested, I would say try any of those things.
I thank you for that. I hadn't even prepped you on that question. It's usually the only thing I give people and I forgot. So sorry.
No, that's totally okay. And I mean, I teach, so it's helpful.
It's true. You're ready with the syllabus.
But also, yeah, if they follow us on Instagram, they can always see any new thing that comes up.
It's great. So final question, Suchi. We're in 2025. May 2025, as we look towards the future, imagine another 25 years of your practice. So we're in 2050. What's your greatest hope for the future of neuroaesthetics?
My greatest hope is that it becomes as essential and ingrained into design to really think about what we're doing, all this material, carbon, energy that we're putting into making our world. Are we doing it for the right reasons? I really wanted to be able to affect that. And I see that it could.
I love that. Thank you so much for joining us. I knew it would be a fascinating conversation and it did not disappoint. Thanks Suchi Reddy of Ready Made, based in New York City, for joining us on Future of XYZ.
Thank you, Lisa. It's always a pleasure. See you soon.
See you soon. And for everyone watching and listening, make sure that you follow us on Instagram, subscribe wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. And if you prefer to watch and you're not already, you can watch every episode every other Thursday on YouTube. We will see you again in 2 weeks. Thanks again.
Thanks, Lisa. Bye.